Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today for our August session of our Learning Burst. This is the last month. Next week, the week after, we will be talking about infant breastfeeding. So, thank you all for coming on. Thank you for this summer. And I would like to introduce everybody to our new program assistant in the SEFs department under the logistics team. And this is Kalaya P. Carrion. And she will be taking Emma's place and doing all those wonderful things. So when you need to ask questions, you feel free that you can ask her those questions as well and email her. But we are going to go ahead and get started. And today we have Jocelyn Dixon with us to talk a little bit about eating with those children and those babies. So I thank Jocelyn for doing this and being with us today. As always, drop any questions you may have in the chat. And we at the as we're going, we can make sure that we are interacting and we are talking with Jocelyn, and I'll make sure she sees and gets those questions, okay? All right, so if nothing else, I will turn everything over to Jocelyn.
All right. Hello, everybody. I hope that your week has been going well, that you've been staying dry, if possible, in North Carolina right now. Over the next hour, we're going to be talking, like Sharonda said, about feeding with preschoolers in particular, and young children, and best practices for that. And it's going to be a little interactive as much as you can. You know, if you're not driving and you're able to drop things in the chat, Q&As in the chat. It's totally great. I'll also ask some questions, some informal polling that you can just send a quick, yeah, that happened to me, or yes, no, into the chat as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides and make sure everybody can see them. And then beautiful. All right, let's share these. And Sharonda, if there's questions, you can let me know too, because the chat's going to be a little hard to see until the end.
We are good to go, and everything looks great on the screen.
Okay, perfect. All right, so like I said, we're going to be talking about feeding family style today. And my name is Jocelyn Dixon, and I work at NC State. I'm also in Extension. I work for Dr. Virginia Stage in the feed lab. So we work on feeding with young children. We've got a couple of different programs that we run through Extension. And I am also a registered dietitian. And so I did my schooling out in the East at ECU, so I am a pirate through and through, undergrad and graduate school pirate, but now I am a proud Wolfpack member as well, so I'm excited to be with y'all today. I'm not sure if some of y'all were at my session at the meeting in May, but if you were, some of the slides will sound a little familiar, but we're going to be focusing more on the mealtime today. All right. So our mission at the Feed Lab, which stands for Food-Based Early Education, is to empower teachers, families, and communities on how to improve children's dietary quality through education, exposure, and access to healthy food. So it goes right alongside with the intentions and the goals of from the ECE and working with children across the preschool age. So today specifically, we're going to examine some background on feeding and behaviors with feeding in the preschool realm. We're going to explore best practices for family style feeding, which is sort of the gold standard. Well, no, sort of about it. It's the gold standard for feeding with young children, and to discuss barriers and tips and troubleshoot a little bit on that as well. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started with feeding. So before we get too far in, and you can give me a thumbs up if you want to use a thumbs up instead of the chat, how many people, when they were growing up, were forced to sit at the table and eat all of their vegetables before they could get up? And it was very pressuring or traumatizing. I know for me, I had to do that. I had to sit at the table and eat my vegetables. Or else I was going to eat them cold for breakfast. So that was, okay, I see Cassandra said, for sure. Yeah, that's a common experience that we have to sit and eat our peas until they are all gone. How about, has anyone tried to disguise or had someone disguise to them vegetables that were hidden in a dish? So maybe you were a kid and you ate your mac and cheese, and then your grandma said, "Ha, there was cauliflower in there," or some other casserole, things were hidden. Or simply tried to get a child to eat vegetables by smothering them in cheese, covering them up. Anyone have that experience before? Feel like a vegetable detective? What about, anyone have an experience before where they were told you can't have dessert until you finish your vegetables? Anyone have that experience? That was definitely me. We definitely had to eat all of our dinner before we could eat whatever sweet was baked that day. So be thinking kind of about your own experiences. These are pretty common in US culture in terms of feeding children. And then whoever has a bad day, or maybe as an adult has a bad day and was treated to ice cream or treated to something else to cheer themselves up. Anyone in the chat, anyone thumbs up that you've had that experience before? Pretty common experiences. So the reason I like to start this with asking those questions is because we really have to grapple with our own upbringing with regard to eating in order to do a good job of feeding preschoolers. Because all of those experiences that we had as children impact how we think and how we behave and how we feed those around us and ourselves as adults. And so I like to kind of start with us pondering our experiences before and just confirming everybody can see these slides advancing. Sharonda, everything's looking progressing fine.
All good.
Okay, so you should see a little girl with watermelon. So,
Yes.
why focus on feeding? Put basically, everybody has experiences with food every day because we need food to survive. And so, no matter what your position is or what your role is, everyone encounters food every day. And when we put ourselves in the shoes of a child, feeding is a exploration, right? There's new things to be discovered. There's new tastes to try. There's developing of preferences. There's the cultural and familial and social aspects of food, all tied into food being so much more than the thing that just fuels our body and just helps children to grow and mature. It's so much more than that. And so we love focusing on feeding because it's something that everyone has experiences with, and it's so important for developing a well-rounded child in more areas than one. So speaking of, if you were at my talk in May, we showed a slide similar to this. I kind of want to talk about the background of feeding before we dive too much further, because has anyone here seen the My Plate? So is this My Plate? And put in the chat. Have you seen this before? Do you know what the My Plate is? Yes, no, never seen it. Seen it all the time. Yes. Okay, I've got one yes.
Yes.
Somebody's seen it. Fun fact, trivia fact, okay, I got two yeses for sure. Perfect. What trivia question, what did the My Plate replace? So what was the visual before the My Plate? I'll give 10 seconds. Anyone know what the visual was for what we should be eating before the My Plate came out? My Plate came out around 2011. Before 2011. So think in the 90s, what was on packaging, what was on posters? Bingo, Cassandra, food pyramid. So the My Plate, yes, exactly. I got multiple food pyramids. Ding, ding, ding. So before the My Plate, the food pyramid was what the government used to kind of give a visual for what we should be eating in a day. The My Plate has since replaced the food pyramid, like I said, since 2011, and is really meant to be more of a visual for what a plate might look like. And actually, I was just at a conference last week in Tennessee with USDA representatives, and they are working this year to get out a whole slew, a whole what's the word I'm looking for? Like repository of images of my plates that look different, right? Because this is a very standard looking American plate, but a lot of cultures may eat out of bowls. They may combine foods in one. There may be soups. And so super exciting side tidbit that has nothing to do with feeding children, but it does because, you know, everybody exists in their own culture. There's going to be a bunch of new images for my plate, which is super exciting as a dietitian. But that being said, exactly right. The My Plate helps us to visualize what we should be eating in a day. And a child, a preschool child, should be consuming about 1 to 1.5 cups of fruits a day and 1.5 cups of vegetables a day, according to the USDA and My Plate. The question, however, is what is typical eating? Drop in the chat. The typical preschooler that you know, are they meeting these recommendations? Are they eating a plate that looks like this plate? Yes or no? And if no, what might their plate look more like? I'll give about 10 seconds. Any thoughts? Are you seeing that happening? Is it looking like a My Plate when they're eating?
Can everybody hear her so that you can respond back?
Okay,
Okay,
a
they're
lot.
starting to
I'm seeing
come
a
in.
lot.
Thank
Yes, at the
you.
daycare. Yes, it's provided. Yep, those components are definitely provided. But not every child necessarily eats what's provided at, what's provided at childcare. We make sure that we've got each of those components, and we're going to talk later on about why that's super important that we do that. But typically, what's typical actually might look like this. A child might have spaghetti and they might wipe off all the sauce and just eat the noodles. Or they might push the noodles to the side and just eat the meat sauce. And so a typical preschooler plate is not going to look like the gold standard necessarily. And the point of me saying that is to say that's okay. We're going to talk in a little bit about what happens when the adult tries to get too involved in what the child's eating. But for sure, if you're participating in CACFP, working towards just general standard good practice guidelines, when you're providing food at your centers, there is each of those components, but what the child necessarily ingests may not exactly be in those proportions. So what is typical? If you were again at my talk in May, this slide will be familiar. So young children may eat 1 or 2 things at each meal or snack. That's normal. Some children eat far more. Some eat far less, and both grow in a healthy way. That's normal. Young children typically prefer carbohydrates, pasta, breads, potatoes, sweets, that type of thing, because their bodies are growing and changing so rapidly. They need excess energy, and carbohydrates is our body's fastest fuel source. Um, Children's intake may decrease after infancy, and some parents find this confusing and concerning and often act accordingly, which can be detrimental. But decrease after infancy, a decreased interest in eating can be normal. And intake varies drastically based on energy level, activity level, genetics, all different things. So drop in the chat, who here knows a picky eater at their center, is a parent, grandparent, neighbor to a picky eater? And if they're a picky eater, what types of things do they just like to eat? I'll give about 10 seconds to see if we know any picky eaters out there and what types of food those picky eaters are. We have lots of picky eaters here, Kim says. Mostly favor the carbs. Yes to noodle. Yes. No
No
noodle.
noodles.
Okay, no noodles.
Another one, it
Okay,
depends on the texture of the food.
yeah, texture, definitely. Texture is a huge one when we're working with young children. And I definitely agree. A lot of the preschoolers I've seen, Kim, also favor the carbs. The no noodles, that's interesting. I haven't heard this one, but maybe it could be a texture thing, right? That they're kind of spongy. So we all can relate to knowing a picky eater. And this is actually yes, I see more textures coming in. Exactly. It's definitely a texture thing, and we're going to talk about how to impact that in a minute. But it's really developmentally appropriate that a child is a picky eater, especially in the ages to 3 to 5. We see that something called neophobia, which is the fear of the new, fear of new foods, peaks in that window, that developmental window. Because if you think about it, for the first time, typically a child is away from their parent or their grandparent or a known caregiver, and they're spending a large portion of their day in a setting that's unknown with an adult that they don't have established rapport with. And so they're used to eating what mommy cooks, they're used to eating what grandma cooks, they're used to eating what their neighbor cooks. And now they're in a situation where they aren't familiar with these foods. And so, biologically, there is an increase in fear around eating new foods, which lends itself, often leads to what we're used to seeing, picky eating, the upsettedness around what's being served, etc. But it's actually really to be expected at this age group as children are learning more and becoming more autonomous. So how do we deal with this? Repeated exposure is a concept that with repeated time and time again exposure to the same food, we can change children's preferences and consumption of that food. And typically the literature says we need about 8 to 12 exposures to the same food. So if there's a texture issue with tomatoes, they're too slimy. The first time we offer tomatoes, it's not likely to be accepted with open arms, right? But it might take that second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth time that a child has the opportunity to explore a tomato, that tomato might end up in their mouth and they might enjoy it. Or maybe it ends up in their mouth and they spit it out. And then maybe on the 11th time, they enjoy it. But we know with lots of research that's been going on since the early 1990s that, well, actually, this research started in 1973, but there's been a whole plethora come out in the 90s up until now that we can actually impact by simply exposing children over and over to the same vegetable. It kind of works like this. Again, if you were at my May session, we talked about this. It's sort of like a song that you hear on the radio. It's a theory that comes from psychology called the theory of mere exposure. You hear the song for the first time and you're like, meh, not sure I like it. After the few repetitions, you're like, okay, I like this song. And then after a couple more repetitions, you're like singing it in the shower or singing it on your way home from work. And you're like, wait a second, I didn't like this song. This happened to me on the latest Taylor Swift song, Anti-Hero, I think is what it's called. I was like, meh. And then I was like, I like this song. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to play this song every day. And so this same concept works with food such that we replace the song with broccoli or sub in whatever food you want. But the first time, there's not a whole lot of reception, but over time and repetition, we can change someone's preference and liking for a vegetable. The issue is, right, that if we tell parents, well, don't worry, your child doesn't like broccoli now, but if you offer it 8 to 12 times at home, your child would eventually begin to like broccoli. They'll probably look at you like you have 5 heads. Like, I'm not putting broccoli on the table 11 times for it to be rejected, right? And so that's where us as individuals who work in the child care arena can support families because we are providing these foods at our centers and assisting in those exposures that children need to those healthy foods. And so we aren't asking the families to walk this path alone. We're coming alongside them and providing them with additional exposures at school. And if you want to learn more a little bit about the exposure things that I just talked about, you can scan that QR code and I'll make sure you get these slides afterwards to be able to do that. And we have training videos that are short, less than 5 minutes on each of these concepts. So when you think about all the things that I've talked about so far, we see that there's a lot at play with what actually ends up being eaten by a preschooler. So we've got lots of different factors from things that are going on at home to whether that be cultural, whether that be access. There's lots of things happening with societal norms. There's lots of things happening with behaviors and attitudes around food. And so it's sort of, you can see in these concentric circles, it's like, it's not just food, it's all of these things that are leading up to the feeding environment that matter and that make an impact. And so put simply, we've got two kind of buckets. We've got our developmental influence bucket. We've got our environmental influence bucket. And I like this slide just because, not because you need to memorize all the things that are on there, but just to sort of recognize that it's a complex arena, right? It's not just showing up at the table and eating your vegetables. There's a lot happening when we're talking about feeding young children, a lot of different things that are playing into the bucket. And so this slide is really just showing, because there's so much at stake, because there's so much at play in terms of what a child chooses to eat, not eat, the feeding environment, all the different things. It can often feel like this spiral, right? Because like we said, the neophobia, the fear of the new for the child, is developmentally appropriate at the 3 to 5 age range. But the problem is that when the caregiver, the teacher, the center director, whatever, sees it, the parent sees it, it leads to worry. Maybe there's a lack of information. Is this normal? Is something wrong with the child? Maybe there's poor advice coming from a social media platform or who knows where, leading or learning from how we were fed growing up, right? So those examples that we started with, each of those are detrimental practices, whether it's forcing a child to eat food, using food as a reward, you have to eat everything till you get dessert, hiding food. All of those are really detrimental practices for feeding. So maybe that happens, and then we've got this pressure, we've got resistance from the child, and then it becomes this tug of war battle between the caregiver, the provider, and the child. And I hope by the end of the presentation today, you've got some tools in your pocket for how to avoid this spiral, because this spiral is really what leads to such a negative mealtime environment and eating experience for child and caregiver. So we've kind of talked about the biological background for feeding, just to sort of give a snapshot as a registered dietitian of sort of why the work that you do and the foods that you provide in your centers are important. And just some quick background: North Carolina ranks 18 out of 50 in the United States for childhood obesity. So we are of the top states for childhood obesity. Um, and rural children, for those working in rural areas, are 1 in 3 times, more likely to be 26% higher odds for developing obesity than urban children. And then we know that after the COVID pandemic, that we've seen an increase in childhood overweight and obesity. And we know through established research that the behaviors that children adopt right now, even as young as preschool, um, have long-term health implications into adulthood, meaning what they learn and how they learn to eat now impacts whether or not they'll have um, diet-related diseases like diabetes, like chronic kidney disease, all these different things, obesity, all these things that are tied to how they learn to eat at such a young age. And that sometimes this slide feels like a downer, but honestly, I feel like it's, wow, this is so empowering that we have the ability to impact this field in what we do every day by the foods we serve and by how we interact and teach children and engage them at the mealtime environment. And so this is just a slide kind of showing over time in North Carolina the changes in overweight and obesity. And at this point, 1 in 3 children in North Carolina are overweight or obese by the time that they enter preschool. So going back to what I was just saying about this being sort of somewhat empowering, and the ability that you have to make a difference in children's lives with regards to feeding, because children spend, on average in the US, 30 plus hours a week in a preschool or a childcare center, where they consume 50 to 75% of their meals at school. And so we have the ability to make such a positive impact in this arena. And for those participating in the chat, just put a yes if you participate in CACFP at your center. When I met people at the May event, I had some that were and some that weren't. But CACFP, in addition, is an additional bolster to be able to provide all of the different food components that build a healthy plate for our young kiddos. Okay, I see one yes so far on CACFP. Yeah, CACFP is great because it helps us to make sure that okay, I'm seeing a couple yeses roll in. That makes sure that we have each of those components for a healthy meal at the table. So this begs the question, okay, so you've told me about like the neophobia, you've told me about the fear of the new, you've told me that it's normal. You've said, okay, meals are really important and what they eat, it's going to impact long-term health status. Okay, you've told me that some of these practices that my parents or my grandparents did to me are probably not super helpful. So, like, where do we go from here? What's the golden question, which is how do we create meal times that support our children? And so now we're going to kind of shift over to explore best practices for family style feeding. So family style feeding is a method of feeding where teachers and children are equal participants in the entire process, from setting the table to cleaning up. Go ahead and drop in the chat now if a yes, if your center does family style dining, where the food is placed on the table, as you see here, and children serve themselves more or less to the ability that they can. We're going to kind of talk about why family style dining is super important. A yes or no, is your center currently doing family style dining? Okay, I see a couple no's. Maybe throughout the presentation, kind of take some tidbits and see if they could be amended to be able to be used in your center. There's definitely all of these strategies can also be used if your center is not set up to be able to do this. But the idea is that in meal times, teachers and children become equal participants, and that can be true whether or not you're able to do the family style dining. So Eat Family Style, I've got the QR code to their website. This is our colleague, Dipti Dev at University of Nebraska, and she's got all sorts of training on the importance of eating family style. And eating family style has multiple different components, right? So one of them being child responsibility, one of them being teachers' responsibilities. For example, teachers' role model. Teachers provide praise, whereas children explore with their senses at the mealtime. Children practice self-regulation. Children serve themselves. That's typically what people think of when they think of family style dining, is this picture of the bowls on the serving bowls on the table and children serving themselves onto their plates the amount that they would like. And so that's one of the keystone parts of family style dining, but you also have each of these others. So we're going to kind of talk through some of these components and how it could be beneficial in your center. But just know, like this slide says, the main goal of best practice when we're feeding children is that teachers and children are equal partners in the process. So child involvement, this is, like I said, what people usually think of when they think of family style dining, is that children are able to serve themselves. So you can see these boys in the picture scooping out with developmentally appropriate scoops the food onto their plate. So this allows children to practice their fine motor skills, learn numbers, whether he's using maybe like a fourth of a cup, putting it onto his plate, giving them the autonomy to choose how much of the food that they receive. You can also practice giving children involvement, giving them more autonomy, creating an equal partnership by allowing them to have setup and cleaning tasks. So asking one child to set out the napkins, another child to set out the forks, or each child to set their own place setting. And the cleanup, asking them to scrape their plates. I know in Head Start, every child has to dump out their milk and scrape their plates and put it away as part of the mealtime. And the more that the child feels responsible and engaged in their mealtime, from setting the table to the end, the more invested they're going to be in the foods that are being provided. And remember, with this, I get this question a lot. Well, what if they didn't take everything? What if their plate doesn't look like this? It's okay. It is normal and expected that their plate will not look like my plate as they're learning and growing. And again, for all those reasons on the slide, for what is typical, that is not to be expected. And it's okay. As adults, we think it has to be this. It's okay. And with CACFP, all of those food components are provided. You make sure that you've got your grain, your protein, your dairy, all of those things are provided for reimbursement purposes and to make sure that there's a well-rounded meal being provided, but they do not have to be consumed by the child. So after each of my components, I like to do a little bit of a table talk scenario so that we can really envision what might be said in the classroom and how we might be able to tweak that to make it more of a positive statement in line with best practices for feeding. And so takes, for example, this comment, don't take so many scoops, just do one scoop, please. How could we change that? So if a child is scooping out a bunch of pineapple, how can we change that? Maybe we could say, let's start with one scoop. And if you're hungry after, there will be more and you can have more. Or what about this one? Concerned that they didn't take any vegetables. You didn't take any green beans. Can you please just put a tiny scoop on your plate? So this might be a child who's apprehensive or fearful or does not like green beans. How could we change that? What if we encourage them to explore it with their senses? Would you like to smell the green beans first to see if you might like to try it? And then remind the child you don't have to eat it. So again, we want to make sure that the autonomy for deciding what goes into the body is the child's and the child's alone. But we can invite them, thinking back to those exposures, we can invite them to explore the food that they're apprehensive about using a different sense. So using their sense of touch or using their sense of smell. Oops. Or this one, you put carrots on your plate, but you haven't touched them. You need to try them. What if instead we said, are you interested in trying the carrots or orange slices that are on your plate? And allowing the child to say yes or no and respecting their decision. Again, when we think of best practices for feeding children, we want to make sure that teacher or caregiver and child are equal partners in the decision. It's not a hierarchy where the teacher or caregiver tells the child what they do or don't get to eat. And this is pretty revolutionary. All right. Let's see. Kids R Us asked, so what do you say to the child if he does not put any vegetables on their plate? That's a great question. In that case, we can invite them, like on the last slide, to say, did you miss the green beans? Would you like to try them? They're so fresh and crunchy. I really enjoy how they pair with my mashed potatoes. We invite them, and if they say, nope, I don't want any green beans, then you say, okay, and we put the bowl of green beans down and we move on. We're going to talk a little bit more about what happens later on, but biologically, the child has an innate curiosity and they will begin to become more interested in the green beans without us ever even talking about green beans with the other children role modeling and always the teacher or caregiver role modeling and just eating the green beans because children naturally want to be like, especially at the preschool developmentally, they want to be like their caregivers. And so they see them eating the green beans. They will, without any words being spoken about green beans, they will likely, over a couple exposures, become interested in trying the green beans themselves. Excellent question, though, because again, as adults, we feel driven that their plate needs to look like the my plate, and it doesn't. The most important thing is that child and adult are equal partners. And whenever a question is asked, the child has the autonomy to say no. And we're going to talk about the boundaries for that in a minute. All right, so key component number 2, children are developing self-regulation through this. So children are in the driver's seat during their meal. That's what I've been saying with the autonomy piece. Children get to decide what and how much they eat, supporting their ability to choose what goes in their body and determine their internal hunger and fullness cues. This is really important because we are all born biologically with the ability to assess when we are full, when we are hungry. And as children might have a delicious meal in front of them and they're eating, they're loving it, they're loving it, they're loving it, and then they stop before they finish their plate. And they stop because their body is telling them, I'm full, I don't need any more food. As adults, because of the clean plate rule and or clean plate club and there's another phrase, I'm forgetting it right now, but because of these ideas that we have to finish what's on our plate, as adults, we move through our childhood and adolescence and teenage years, we lose the ability to self-regulate and to realize, hey, I'm full. I actually don't need to keep eating because then I will be too full. We want to make sure that children retain that ability. And so they get to decide what and how much. And teachers get to help in this process by teaching children vocabulary to express these feelings of fullness and hunger. And again, always respecting children's sentiments or feelings after they're expressed. And again, I'll make sure you get the slides and there's a training video on what this slide is talking about. Now, some of you are probably sitting and you're probably thinking to yourself, this person, Jocelyn, is crazy. I do not know what she's talking about. This is not how we feed children in our center. And that's okay. This is a really drastic way to think about changing the way that we think about feeding our children. A lot of what I'm talking about today comes from Ellen Satter, and she was an amazing professional whose whole life was dedicated to studying how to feed children in the way that's best for feeding children to promote autonomy and long-term health outcomes. And so she terms what I've been talking about called the division of responsibility in feeding. And you're going to see in my citations a lot of Satter work because she is phenomenal. And at the end, I've got a resource QR for you if you want to learn more about her works. So if you're feeling like this is revolutionary, it's because it is. It's a different way of thinking about it, but it promotes the best for the child. So this slide really captures what I talked about, the boundaries, right? So the adult gets to choose what, where, and when, and the child gets to decide how much and whether. And so the what, where, and when, let's start let's work bottom up. So the adult gets to decide when. So when is food available? So we want to avoid this idea of like grazing, where the child dictates, I'm hungry, and then they get a snack. Instead, it's most beneficial if there is a schedule of when things are being provided, so the child knows exactly when food will be offered. This is really natural in a childcare setting because we have schedules that are followed from the time the child arrives to the time the child ends, including washing hands and going to the bathroom. It's very scheduled out. And so this is a natural part of being in the childcare center. So that checkbox is there. And the important part about that is just that the child knows when food will be offered. So there's not guesswork. And so that when food is provided, they're not eating more than they need to eat because they're concerned about when food will be provided next. So that's really the importance of that, knowing the schedule. The where is we eat at the table, right? Establishing the place where food is consumed is super important because that tells the child's brain, right now, when I'm sitting at this table and there's a napkin in front of me and a plate in front of me, that means this is the time to be eating. So those cues, environmental cues. And then the last thing is the what. And as a dietitian, this is the really important part because the child is not, short ordering like they're at a restaurant, what's being served. The adult gets to choose what is on the menu. And so that avoids, so maybe going back to Kim's question, they don't eat the green beans that were served, but maybe there was sweet potatoes as the carbohydrate and barbecue chicken as the protein. And so if they just have barbecue chicken and sweet potatoes, that's okay because both of those things that were provided, that were chosen by the adult, are great and wholesome foods for the child to be consuming. It's okay that the green beans went untouched. And so the adult chooses what's provided, right? So what's on the table is not just Lucky Charms and Kit Kats, right? There's wholesome food on the table, which following CACFP, we know there will be wholesome food provided, but the child gets to decide how much of that food they take and potentially eat, and whether or not they even decide to eat it. And that's really the part that's tricky, right? Because again, if you walk away with nothing else from this presentation, I want you to really think about how can I make sure in the meal times at my center, the adult and the child are equal partners. There's no hierarchy, there's equal partnership and divided responsibilities. So this slide, I'm not going to walk through all of it. Again, I'll make sure you have your slides. But again, the parent or the teacher or the center director's responsibility is choosing the food, setting the routine, and the child's decision is what and how much they eat of that. And that last bullet point is really important, that pressure and coercion may have short-term benefits, but will ultimately make the feeding environment more difficult and less rewarding for everyone involved. We really want to avoid that tug of war. So I love this quote from Ellen Satter's work. She says, to be a good eater, your preschooler does not have to eat everything that is put before him. He has to know how to behave at the table. So thinking about that, where, mind is manners. So learning and preschools are great at doing this and working on manners at the table, and have some good food approach and food refusal skills. So learning how to have autonomy over what eats and doesn't eat. All right, so who here has heard about the one bite rule? People love the one bite rule. So the one bite rule is basically you have to take a bite of at least every food that's being offered on the table. And we see it all the time. Our work at NC State really focuses in the preschool arena, and we see it all the time in the preschools that we are at. Teachers all the time are like, you didn't take any green beans. You at least have to put one on your plate. So you can do one, take one bite with me, one tiny bite with me. So I get the question a lot, what about the one bite rule? Is it bad? Well, let's think about in context of what we've just talked about with the division of responsibility. The one bite rule, when we boil it down, it's really a control tactic for the adult to feel like the child ate something of what they were desiring them to eat. And it ignores that idea that children naturally want to expand their eating on their own terms. Children are naturally curious. They're experiencing lots of things for the first time, developing their own experiences to build their knowledge off of. And so when we ask for a no thank you bite, we're inherently telling the child that we don't really trust them to learn and grow on their own speed, on their own terms. And we're instead sort of trying to insert our own feelings and our own agendas into their decision-making skills. And so again, it goes back to that idea that we can always invite a children. We can always encourage a child by saying, these carrots are so crunchy. I love the way it tastes when I dip it in the ranch. It's so refreshing. Would you like to try some with me? And then if the child says, yes, I'd love to, great, have that moment together. If they say, nope, yuck, I hate carrots, then you can say, okay, well, that's all right that carrots aren't your favorite. Let's express that a little bit more politely because some of our friends here, they might enjoy carrots. So how about instead we just say, no, thank you. I would not like any carrots today. And that's all right. We allow the child to refuse the food. And again, our focus is really on creating a pleasant mealtime environment for both the caregivers and the children at the table. I love this quote. It says, teach children to pass the food, but don't make them take any. If they take some, don't make them taste it. If they taste it, don't make them swallow it. If they swallow it, don't make them eat anymore. And don't make them eat everything they have taken. I feel like my presentation could just be this slide and that would be enough. But this idea that, again, children are the drivers of their own ship. They are behind the steering wheel. We allow them to make the decisions for themselves, but teaching them table manners, teaching them how to pass the food, teaching them how to politely say no thank you, but also allowing them to have the exploration to explore because children are naturally curious and they're going to be interested in food and trying foods. It's just going to take some time and a decrease of pressure from the caretaker's position. And again, all of this is to avoid this really tug of war. We really want to make mealtimes a pleasant environment where children can explore on their own terms and enjoy food as it's meant to be enjoyed. Together as a classroom, sitting together and enjoying a meal together. And so another researcher, Dr. Davis, a long time ago, talked about 3 different kind of camps that children fall into. And as I'm talking about these, you're probably going to identify with one of these, whether you have a child or whether you know a child in each of these. So there's the enthusiast. The enthusiast is a child who is gung-ho about every new experience. They're excited to try new foods. It doesn't take much. They're just like, oh, we're having jicama today. I'm curious in jicama about jicama, or we're having radishes. Oh, I've always wanted to try a radish. They're quick to try. Then we have the accumulator. The accumulator is the child who's a little hesitant, but she might see the person sitting next to her who's trying it and saying, this is so yummy, and she might be apt to try it. It just might take a little bit more. She's not as gung-ho as the enthusiast. And then the last one is the late bloomer. The late bloomer is someone who's like, nope, I am not eating that. And over time, over years, they eventually come around to it. And the key is that they all children, whichever camp they fall in, ends up eating a well-rounded table if the best practices that we're talking about are the division of responsibility is executed at both in the home and in the child care center. And as child care center professionals who are here today, you have a great opportunity to provide this positive eating and feeding environment in your center. And so know that all paths are okay. All right, so some more table talk. Instead of saying, are you done? It looks like you're just playing with your food now. We could say, provide cues about how to assess if we're hungry or not. Is your tummy full? Are the rumblies gone? You can stop eating once you're full, again, encouraging that self-regulation. Or instead of, you've already had a lot of pasta, let's eat your broccoli now. Say, it looks like you're enjoying the pasta. If we run out of pasta and you're still hungry, you can try some broccoli. Um, and again, if they choose not to, that's okay. Saying, instead of saying, we don't waste food, let's make a happy plate so you aren't hungry later. Instead, we encourage self-regulation. We stop eating when our tummy is full. It's okay to leave food on your plate. It's really important that children know it's okay to stop when they're finished and full and satisfied. Knowing that, again, if it's lunchtime, they know in 2 hours it will be snack time, so they can eat to the pleasant fullness. Now, this key is really important because we can't necessarily control what a child does, right? You're going to have children who act one way or act another way, no matter what you do, but we can control what the adult in the classroom is doing. So it is so important that teachers eat with and eat what children are eating. It's super important that teachers talk positively about the foods they are eating, even if it's not their most favorite food, right? Um, Saying things like I talked about earlier. Wow, this tomato is so juicy. I love the way that it goes with my noodles. Or this carrot is so crunchy. Or these potatoes feel so soft. Um, and that teachers verbalize their own hunger and fullness cues. So they sit down at the table. Wow, my stomach is grumbling. I'm hungry. After the meal, pushing away their plate and saying, maybe with still some food on it, wow, I'm full. My stomach feels happy now. And also, teachers can draw attention to peer role models in the classroom, which I'll show you in a minute what that could look like. And teachers promote the idea that we all have different likes and dislikes. A child is perfectly within their own right to not like cucumbers, just in the same way you're perfectly within your right to not like cucumbers. But we want to promote this saying, don't yuck someone else's yum. And this peer role modeling and this adult role modeling is so important because children do what they say, not what they, or sorry, children do what they see, not what we say. And if you need, or if you'd like, there's another training video right there about modeling. And this is something that we can provide. You can provide training with your teachers, because they're eating with their children every day. So table talk. I saw Nevaeh eat all of her corn. Can you be like her and eat yours? Nevaeh, could you tell Camilla what you, instead of saying that, could you say, Nevaeh, could you tell Camilla what you liked about the corn today? What did it taste like? Inspire communication around the food versus probing someone to eat it. Instead of saying, I don't like peas, say, these peas are green, crunchy, and fresh, but my tummy is full, so I'm going to stop eating. So training different ways to talk about foods that maybe we don't have a preference about, we can still positively describe their attributes, their color, their texture, just saying that they're fresh, that type of thing. Or a child saying, this salsa is gross, I'm not eating that. Instead, encourage them, the teacher, to respond with, everyone has their own likes and dislikes. Let's not yuck someone else's yum. All right, on to rewards and praises. So we want children to be intrinsically motivated to eat. And so rewards shift that motivation to the external. So if we're thinking about, you can't have any more pasta until you finish your broccoli, we're shifting the motivation externally for them to get to the broccoli. Instead, we really want to increase children's intrinsic motivation to eat. And so we want them to have, again, the autonomy to choose what they do and don't eat. And we want, the more we can get children involved as equal partners, the more interested they're going to be. So setting the table, cooking, cleaning. You can see a child here in one of our preschool centers helping to prepare the carrots. And if we're offering praises, we want to make sure it's connected to an action, not a character trait. And I always like to say, no one can be good, a good child, a good girl, a good boy for eating their vegetables. It's simply not possible. We don't want to connect good or bad with their eating habits. So instead of saying, Michaela, you were such a good girl today, you ate all your vegetables at lunch, we could say, Michaela, I like how you were brave to try new vegetables at lunch, and it looks like they were yummy to you. Instead of saying, you can't have more mashed potatoes until you finish your collards, you could say, I like mashed potatoes, but I also like collards. They have vitamins that keep me from getting sick. And you see here, the teacher never invited the child to eat the collards. She's simply positively talking about the collards for herself in the hopes that the child, developmentally speaking, aspires to be similar to the adult in the room and may want to try them along with the teacher. But we didn't even need to ask, eat your collards. We never had to say those words. Next one, if you finish your plate, you can get a sticker. So instead of using a reward that revolves around food, we could say, if you finish your plate, that tells me you were really hungry after running around on the playground. Wasn't recess fun? All right, we're zooming through, but I'm trying to get through all of these. We might just have to provide some slides, and I want to leave at least a minute or two for any questions. So sensory exploration. So children are naturally curious about the world around them, like I've been saying. Food is just another area for them to explore and discover. It's really important that children are given the opportunity to explore their food with their senses. That does not include their sense of taste. So using their sense of touch, using their sense of smell, using their sense of hearing. What does it sound like when I crack the celery? Um, and know that those 8 to 12 exposures that we talked about, all exposures to foods count, even the ones that aren't at the mealtime. And actually, research shows that the ones outside of the mealtime can be super, super important and powerful because there's no pressure. There's no expectation that the food's getting eaten. We're simply exploring it. So you can see this child here is exploring a spinach plant as part of a science lesson. And maybe at lunch, he'll be more inclined to try spinach, maybe not, but he's getting an exposure to healthy food in an environment where he knows no one's going to ask him to eat this spinach out of this pot, right? And we call this food-based learning. And if you don't already do it in your center, I'd love to talk to you more about it. It's really the crux of what we do at Peas, which is my primary area. My primary area of expertise is this food-based learning arena, having children have experiences with food outside of mealtime. And so here are some slides. I'll make sure you have these, but food-based learning, put simply, is the use of healthy food as a teaching tool to provide repeated exposures and to improve academic learning in some way, whether that's literacy, math, science, you name it, motor skills, etc. We've got an entire program for preschool about food-based learning called PEAS, Preschool Education and Applied Sciences. And again, it's got lots of different components. It's got teacher trainings, it's got built-in activities, it's got environmental supports. I'd be happy to talk to anybody who's interested in it. But for sake of time, I'll just put this little plug here. And for anybody who's feeling a little skeptical, like, can these exposures actually make a change? Well, we did a study, this was back in 2019, and children had exposures to healthy foods outside of the mealtime environment. And then we measured what they were eating inside the mealtime environment. And you can see that the red line, those that were participating in these experiences had significantly higher consumption rates of healthy foods than those in the blue line who had a drastic drop in what they were consuming. And again, we've got even less intensive than the full-on PEAS program. We've got kind of a spin-off series that's 6 different healthy food activities that you can do easily, 20 to 25 minutes in the classroom. And we've got it as a free resource that you can implement in your center, again, with the hopes that we're giving children more exposures to healthy foods outside of the mealtime environment so that in the mealtime environment, maybe they're more curious about it. And this is called Peas on My Plate. All right, so as we wind to the end here, we're just going to quickly discuss some barriers and tips to support these best practice feeding best practices in your center. So tips. If you want to try to start implementing family style dining, we want to make sure that we've got cleaning supplies ready. Spills are going to happen, but it's a great opportunity for children to learn how to clean up after themselves. So they dump over the thing of mashed potatoes, teaching them how do we clean that up? We want to make sure we don't put all the food on the table in case a bowl gets contaminated. A child sneezes directly into the bowl of mashed potatoes as they're holding it. We know we can just go put that bowl away and we've got the extra stash of mashed potatoes somewhere else. Have extra serving utensils for when one falls on the floor and making sure that those serving utensils are child-friendly sizes. Encouraging people in the classroom during meal times in conversation, make connection between new foods and books, games, or videos that a child might relate to. So remember when we read that book, Monsters Don't Eat Broccoli? And now we get to have our own broccoli. How cool is that? Sit picky eaters next to less picky eaters. playing on that peer role modeling strategy, provide staff training on feeding best practices, and engage families on learning the importance of creating a positive mealtime environment, both at school and at home. And you can discuss benefits with them about why it's important, why these practices are important. And this is important if you've had parents who are really anxious about how much their child is eating. Maybe they're really small and they're worried about it. Talking with children about the practices and the beliefs that you carry throughout mealtime at your center is super important. And Ellen Satter actually has a handout, and I've got the QR there that is great to provide to parents that shows them how we run feeding in our center. And it outlines the division of responsibility right there. And you're able to reproduce this and print it as long as you print this whole thing, which provides the reference link as well. And so this is a great thing to provide at your centers to sort of create an even playing field and make sure everybody's on the same page about how feeding is handled at your center. Now, to end, kind of some quick things. So we want to be aware too that everybody's got different sensories, right? So children that have sensory sensitivities might say something like, when I eat an orange, it feels like there are little knives hitting my tongue. It's very sharp, right? So they react strongly to citrus. Or maybe they eat something and it feels like a prickly pear or cactus in their mouth, right? Some of these things are normal, right? Or the gush of a tomato juice that we can work with children through. But sometimes there's signs that we might need to move in a different direction. And so if a child's saying it hurts, or I can't, or I'm scared, or I'm uncomfortable, or there's extreme temperament or mood changes, that's when we might want to think about feeding therapy or seeking out speech language pathologist or OT who specializes in pediatric feeding for help. And that's perfectly okay to recognize those red flags and know where you're at. All right. So if you're interested in learning more, so like I said, our colleague Dipti Dev at the University of Nebraska, this is her work. So Eat Family Style, she has tons of resources, tons of trainings. You can visit her website or email that email down there for more information if you're curious and want to learn more. If you were intrigued by any of the quotes that I shared, or this idea of division of responsibility, this is all Ellen Satter's work. I've got a QR to her website. She also runs lots of different trainings. You can see one of their ADHD for the table. These books are amazing books to read. Child of Mine, I cannot recommend enough. It talks about feeding from birth all the way through adolescence. It's fabulous. There's all different resources here if you're interested and want to learn more. If you're just like, what are these children supposed to be eating at this age? If you're confused by CACFP recommendations and you just want to learn where they come from, I've got QR codes here for just general recommendations for serving sizes and different food groups. These are great assessments. So this last is just my spiel on different resources if you want to learn more. There is a great assessment that is put out by the Early Childhood National Center that you can do to kind of see where does your center kind of fall in creating a positive eating environment that you can complete. And then there's even where you can create an action plan for setting goals to improve the eating environment at your center. And I always like to end these talks by just reminding people it can be easy to feel like, oh my gosh, I have so much to fix. I don't even know where to start. Remember, it's a marathon, it's not a race, right? And so we just make small positive changes to move towards these best practices. It's not a race. In the same way that a child learning to eat all of the food groups, enjoy all the foods, be a confident eater is a marathon and not a race. And again, there's so many benefits to these best practices, helping children at the end of the day become confident in themselves and be great guests to have at your kitchen table. And with the hopes that we have today's healthy kids and tomorrow's generation of leaders. And that's why we do the work that we do. And that's why y'all do the work that you do. So I'd like to thank everybody for listening today, for interacting with me. And I know we don't have much time for questions, but my email is there if you have questions or want to reach out about anything that was talked about today. But I'll give the last 2 minutes over for any questions.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn. And as you already stated, you will send your slides to me and I can put everything in a wrap-up email so to make sure that everybody receives that Friday. But other than that, this was a wonderful training. What questions do you all have? Please unmute yourselves and ask that way or either in the chat.
And it's okay if not. I'm a shy unmuter. So if you've got anything, you can put in the chat, or again, we'll send them out. Kim had a great question earlier. Our kids are us.
So what do you say to the child if he does not put any vegetables on their plate?
Yep, that was a great question.
Yep.
That division of responsibility. It's hard. It's a kind of a revolutionary concept. Thank you, Cassandra. I appreciate you being here. I hope you have a wonderful, hopefully dry weekend.
All right. If no one has anything, any comments or concerns or questions, we will end the call today. And we just want to thank you again, Jocelyn, so much.
Of course, thank you for having me. It was good to see everybody. Have a wonderful week.